The alien hive had seen this scenario 1,000 times. Slow ships, heavy with food, medicine, and air. A humanitarian convoy, the easiest prey in the galaxy. Such vessels always behave the same way. They panicked. They scattered. They died. But this time, something went wrong. The convoy did not accelerate. It slowed. Cargo carriers rotated, exposing their armored spines. Medical ships slid inward, disappearing into the heart of the formation. Logistics frames locked together, metal and mass snapping into place like bones forming a single skeleton. The hive attacked, expecting terror and chaos. Instead, it collided with a system built not for war, but for apocalypse. Shields designed to hold atmospheres in place. Tractor fields meant to drag cities from rubble. Medical nanoforges that were never meant to kill, yet did. Human logistics did not fight with rage. It endured. It did what it had always been built to do. Function while everything else was breaking. And while the hive struggled to understand what it was facing, the humans continued with the only objective that mattered. Deliver the aid. Even under attack, cold light rippled across the inner membranes of the swarm consensus as gravity tides whispered through the void, carrying the distant vibration of engines that burned too gently to be war. The approaching convoy painted itself across the hive's perception not as a threat, but as a scent, rich and simple, like ripe biomass drifting into reach. Low-energy signatures pulsed with the dull regularity of machines built to preserve life rather than end it. The faint chemical echo of medical substrates leaked into sensor space, sterile and sharp, layered with the warmer trace of processed food and the metallic tang of atmospheric stabilizers. To the consensus, it was a familiar perfume, one remembered across 1,000 star systems where prey had arrived bearing aid and departed as silence. The convoy's shapes were wrong for battle. Hulls were swollen with cargo volume instead of weapon spines. Power grids branched redundantly, not aggressively, designed to fail softly rather than burn hot. Life support systems overlapped in inefficient abundance, a hallmark of species that feared death more than loss. No harmonic tremor of charging armaments disturbed the void. No disciplined formations tightened their spacing. Civilian vessels, bound by precedent and instinct to scatter at the first shadow of danger, drifted onward along their prescribed vector. The consensus felt the comfort of solved equations settling through its shared mind, probabilities cascading in smooth, descending order toward inevitability. Across prior assimilations, the pattern had never meaningfully varied. Humanitarian fleets arrived with banners of mercy encoded in their transmissions and routines of ritual calm. When confronted, they fractured. Engines flared in panic, ships fled alone, and those that failed were consumed in orderly succession. Fear always arrived first, then fragmentation, then retreat, then the long quiet that followed digestion. The swarm had learned that compassion traveled with predictability, and predictability was edible. Yet even as the consensus prepared assimilation protocols, subtle anomalies brushed against its certainty like grit against chitin. The convoy did not accelerate. Engine notes remained steady, a low hum that vibrated with restraint rather than terror. Internal heat patterns revealed clusters of warm, fragile bodies moving with purpose inside thin hulls. Their heartbeats quickened but not chaotic. The hive tasted cortisol and salt through quantum inference and recognized fear, but it was fear held in check, compressed into something dense and controlled. The consensus cataloged it and moved on, assigning no weight to such inefficiencies. Within those vessels, humanity pressed onward through the dark with hands that trembled and then steadied, boots scuffing worn deck plates polished by years of relief missions. Air recyclers carried the mixed smells of disinfectant, recycled water, and the faint, stubborn presence of home carried in fabric and skin. The void outside remained vast and indifferent, its cold light painting human hulls into small, fragile silhouettes against infinity. To the swarm, they were already reduced to outcome and yield. To the stars, they were nearly nothing at all. And yet they continued to approach, unarmed and unbroken, bearing the quiet weight of lives they refused to abandon. Starlight fractured as the swarm fleets bled from folded space, their arrival bending gravity into low, aching vibrations that rolled across the famine corridor like distant thunder. Dust and frozen gas drifted through the system in pale veils, remnants of stars that had flared too hard, burned too fast, and left nothing behind but hunger. Planets hung in silent orbits, their atmospheres thin and scarred, their nights unbroken by city lights. Long ago, defense grids had gone dark here, their wreckage still tumbling in slow arcs, metal bones picked clean by time and neglect. The corridor smelled of loss even in vacuum, a sensory echo the swarm recognized as opportunity. The consensus absorbed the region's history without emotion. Political alliances had failed, then fractured. Trade routes had withered when profit fell below tolerance. Relief efforts had arrived in waves, and then ceased when ledgers turned red. Other species had calculated the same conclusion and moved on, leaving these worlds to starve quietly. This was not cruelty in the galactic sense. It was efficiency. Resources flowed toward growth, not toward dying systems that offered no return. The swarm understood this logic intimately. It had been born from it. The approaching convoy followed a route etched into every surviving navigation archive, a thin line of stubborn hope threading through emptiness. Its transponders broadcast humanitarian intent with almost ritual consistency. Food processors, medical bays, atmospheric stabilizers. Infrastructure seeds meant to coax fragile planets back toward breath and warmth. No escort signatures accompanied them. No defensive lattice preceded their path. The swarm tasted the data and found it clean, simple, and familiar. Prey arrived alone. Assimilation protocols unfolded through the consensus like muscle memory. Attack vectors aligned. Boarding organisms flexed within their launch cysts, sensing imminent release. The hive's confidence hardened, reinforced by the corridor itself. There was nowhere for the convoy to run. Hyperlanes were sparse and unstable. Gravity wells pulled like open mouths. Even if the ships fled, they would scatter into dead ends and be consumed one by one. The outcome was already written in probability space. The convoy should have scattered. The swarm waited for the spike of engine output, the panicked surge of thrust as fragile hulls attempted escape. It waited for the chaotic bloom of heat and radiation that always marked the moment when fear overwhelmed discipline. Instead, the sensors registered a decrease. Engines softened their song, dropping from a steady hum into something slower, heavier, almost deliberate. Relative velocities shifted not outward but inward. The convoy was reducing speed. At first, the consensus flagged the change's error. Instrument drift. Faulty readings caused by stellar interference. The famine corridor was notorious for that. But the pattern held. Multiple confirmation nodes agreed. The ships were not accelerating away. They were decelerating together. Within the human vessels, gravity shifted subtly as thrust changed, causing unsecured tools to rattle against bulkheads. Air recyclers worked harder, pushing recycled oxygen that carried the faint smells of antiseptic, fabric, and human skin warmed by stress. Hands tightened on rails worn smooth by generations of similar missions. Boots found familiar grooves in deck plating. The soundscape changed from the high, anxious whine of engines at burn to the deeper, steadier pulse of systems settling into a different mode of operation. The swarm perceived fragments of this through indirect means, patterns in thermal flow and life support cycling that hinted at internal activity. Human heart rates rose, but they did not spike into the wild irregularity that usually preceded collapse. Cortisol levels climbed, sharp and bitter, yet they plateaued rather than spiraled. Fear was present, undeniable and raw, but it was being contained, shaped into something functional. The famine corridor had taught the galaxy a lesson over countless lost years. Mercy was unsustainable. The swarm had never encountered meaningful resistance here. It had fed unchallenged, its presence a final punctuation mark at the end of failed equations. The slowing convoy introduced a variable that did not belong. The consensus probed deeper, running parallel simulations. Perhaps the humans intended surrender. Perhaps they were conserving fuel for a last desperate jump. Perhaps internal systems were failing under stress. None of the projections fit cleanly. Surrender, usually manifested as power shutdowns and passive drift. This was controlled, coordinated, and uniform. Failure was chaotic and asymmetrical. This was neither. As the distance closed, the Hive's living hulls cast long shadows across the convoy, blotting out distant stars. Radiation from the swarm's drives washed over human ships, testing shields rated for stellar flares and debris fields. Those shields held, flexing softly, designed to bend rather than break. The consensus noted the resilience with mild interest. Civilian craft often carried such protections for disaster zones. It changed nothing. The convoy continued to slow. From a distance, the human ships began to alter their relative positions, subtle at first, like a school of fish adjusting to a current. Cargo haulers drifted closer to one another. Medical vessels shifted toward the center of the formation. Structural silhouettes overlapped, creating denser masses where before there had been open lanes. The swarm recognized clustering behavior but misread its intent. Prey often huddled in fear before destruction. Yet this huddle lacked desperation. Movements were precise, almost practiced. The timing between adjustments suggested prior planning rather than spontaneous panic. The consensus felt the first faint abrasion against its certainty, like a hairline fracture forming in crystal. The famine corridor watched in silence. Broken satellites tumbled past, their dead surfaces reflecting the growing shadow of the hive and the tightening geometry of the convoy. On distant planets, populations too small and weak to influence events felt nothing, unaware that aid hovered on the brink of annihilation or transformation. The void itself seemed to hold its breath, stars flickering as gravity waves rippled outward. The swarm advanced, confident enough to allow the moment to stretch. It had learned that fear deepened flavor. It had learned that hope tasted sweetest when extinguished at the last possible instant. The consensus expected the human formation to break under that pressure, expected engines to flare and ships to scatter once the reality of proximity set in. Instead, the convoy completed its deceleration and held. Engines idled. Heat signatures stabilized. Power distribution shifted inward, feeding systems not associated with propulsion or escape. To the swarm, it looked like resignation. To the corridor, it looked like a pause before something unprecedented. The consensus finalized assimilation parameters, dismissing lingering anomalies as statistical noise. Civilian convoys did not resist. They never had. The hive prepared to descend fully, a living shadow closing around prey that had inexplicably chosen to stop running. For the first time in its long, efficient existence, the swarm did not notice that the equation it trusted so completely was missing a term. Metal groaned across vacuum as the first cargo carrier rolled along its longitudinal axis. The sound transmitted not through air, but through vibration that shuddered along magnetic couplings and structural frames. Panels designed to face the emptiness of transit turned inward, revealing ribbed spines scored by micrometeor scars and old repair welds. Light from distant stars slid across those surfaces, catching on warning paint faded by radiation and time. The convoy's silhouette began to change, not abruptly, but with the deliberate patience of machinery guided by hands that knew exactly where stress would travel when the universe pushed back. Medical vessels moved next, their engines pulsing in short, precise bursts that nudged them toward the center of the formation. These ships carried the softest cargo of all: incubators, surgical bays, cryo wards lined with pale blue light. Their hulls bore the marks of mercy, red crosses and neutral emblems etched deep enough to survive plasma storms. Now they clustered together, mass overlapping mass, power grids aligning as if drawn by an unseen geometry. The warmth of human life inside them thickened into a single, brighter knot on the swarm's sensors, a concentration of fragile heat refusing to scatter. Around them, logistics frames detached from towing lines with a sequence of muted impacts, clamps releasing in rehearsed order. These frames were skeletal things, lattices of reinforced alloy meant to carry cities in pieces, to drag shattered infrastructure through hostile space. Freed from their cargo trains, they rotated and slid, locking edge to edge, corner to corner, forming shapes that defied the swarm's pattern recognition. Angles repeated and then broke. Symmetry emerged and dissolved. A living blueprint assembled from parts that had never been intended to meet this way. The consensus searched its archives for precedent and found none. For 300 cycles, confusion had been an abstract concept within the hive, a word attached to the failures of other species. Now it arrived as a sensation, a stutter in predictive flow, a hesitation where certainty should have been. This was not flight. No vectors pointed away from danger. This was not surrender. Power remained high, systems active, intent unresolved. The consensus labeled it reorganization under threat and flagged the classification with an error marker that pulsed like irritation. Energy readings surged across the convoy, but not along the channels the swarm expected. No narrow spikes of weapon charge flared into being. Instead, broad rivers of power poured into shield matrices rated to hold back solar flares and atmospheric collapse. Tractor emitters, usually reserved for lifting fallen habitats from planetary crusts, hummed to life, their fields overlapping in complex interference patterns. Field projectors designed to stabilize fault lines and contain runaway storms spun up, bathing the growing structure in invisible forces that pressed and flexed like unseen hands. Inside the human ships, the change was felt in bone and breath. Deck plates vibrated differently now, a deeper resonance that settled into the chest. Air grew warmer as systems pushed beyond nominal output, carrying the mixed sense of overheated circuitry, disinfectant, and recycled oxygen. Sweat beaded on foreheads and along spines, wiped away with practiced motions that spoke of long familiarity with stress. Fingers moved across control surfaces worn smooth by repetition, adjusting flows and tolerances without hesitation. Fear was present, a constant pressure behind the eyes, but it was harnessed, directed into focus. The swarm watched the transformation with growing unease. Its living hulls advanced, shadows stretching across the reconfigured convoy, yet the expected signs of collapse did not appear. Instead, the human formation grew denser, stronger, its mass distribution shifting toward stability rather than dispersal. The consensus attempted to model the new entity and failed. The convoy was no longer a collection of individual ships, but not yet a fortress in any conventional sense. It was something interlocked, a composite organism assembled from civilian parts. Tractor fields reached outward, their invisible grip brushing against debris that littered the famine corridor. Broken satellites, fragments of old defense grids, even clouds of frozen gas were drawn inward, caught and layered onto the structure like improvised armor. Each addition altered mass and momentum calculations, forcing the swarm to recalculate again and again. What had been empty space became a scaffold of captured matter, woven into the human formation with startling efficiency. The hive felt temperature gradients shift as overlapping shields interacted, shedding excess energy into controlled arcs that glimmered faintly against the dark. These were not the sharp flares of combat barriers, but broad, forgiving envelopes meant to absorb punishment over time. They flexed under the pressure of the swarm's approach, bending rather than cracking. Dispersing forced the way flood barriers spread water across sacrificial plains. The consensus noted the design philosophy with something approaching discomfort. This was engineering built for endurance, not dominance. Within the medical cluster, life signs steadied as redundant systems synchronized. Heart rates slowed marginally, breath evened. Humans anchored themselves to routine, checking seals, rerouting power, performing small, grounding tasks that had nothing to do with the enemy and everything to do with staying functional. Somewhere deep in the formation, a hand rested briefly against a bulkhead, feeling its vibration, drawing reassurance from the solidity of metal shaped by human effort. The swarm's advance continued, but its internal state shifted. Attack vectors hesitated as the consensus struggled to determine optimal points of engagement. There were no clear edges now, no isolated targets to peel away. The formation presented surfaces layered with fields and mass, each potential breach backed by another system ready to absorb shock. The hive had evolved to exploit fear and fragmentation. Here, it encountered cohesion under pressure. As the final connections locked into place, the convoy completed its metamorphosis. What had been a line of aged ships became a single, sprawling construct, irregular yet purposeful, its geometry born of necessity rather than doctrine. Light from distant stars fractured across its surfaces, reflecting off scavenged debris and shield shimmer alike. It hung in the void, engines quiet, fields alive, a testament to preparation forged in countless prior disasters. The consensus registered the completed structure and paused. Confusion deepened, spreading through its shared mind like static. The behavior defied its assumptions not because it was aggressive, but because it was patient. The human formation did not lunge or retreat. It held, every system tuned toward surviving whatever came next. For the first time in 300 cycles, the swarm faced prey that had chosen to become something else entirely. The first impact arrived as a deep, pressureless thud that rippled across overlapping fields, a sensation more felt than heard, like a distant earthquake transmitted through metal bones. Organic plasma from the swarm splashed against the outermost defensive layers and spread into luminous sheets, its heat bleeding away as it met barriers designed to endure stellar tantrums. Light bent and fractured, washing the human construct in pale auroras that flickered and dimmed rather than burning through. The void filled with a low, sustained hum as systems compensated automatically, shunting excess energy into reservoirs meant for far worse catastrophes than attack. The swarm pressed harder, launching waves of drones whose chitinous hulls glistened with biological charge. Kinetic spines slammed into the fields and rebounded, their momentum smeared across layers of protection that behaved less like armor and more like skin. Each layer yielded a fraction, flexing and redistributing force inward, where secondary fields caught what remained and softened it further. The human formation shuddered but held, its response measured and patient. This was not a shield meant to deflect a single blow. It was a barrier designed to suffer for long stretches of time. Tractor arrays activated in cascading patterns, their invisible grip reaching outward with controlled urgency. These systems had once lifted collapsed arcologies from poisoned ground, had pulled shattered ships from gravity wells, and held them steady while lives were evacuated. Now they seized swarm drones mid-charge, wrenching them from formation with sudden, brutal clarity. Bodies meant to move as a collective were torn apart, flung into their own advancing ranks. Collisions followed, wet and violent, as organic hulls ruptured against one another. The swarm's advance lost coherence, its beautiful, terrible symmetry collapsing into turbulence. Inside the human structure, gravity fluctuated in tight, tolerable bands. Crew members braced instinctively, knees flexing, hands tightening on rails. The air grew thick with the smell of hot insulation and recycled sweat, tinged with antiseptic from medical bays operating at full capacity. Hearts hammered, ribs ached, and teeth clenched as stress bled into muscle memory. There was no time for panic. Training and habit took over, guiding small, precise movements that kept systems balanced on the edge of overload. Medical nanoforges vented their payload next, releasing clouds of counteragents into space that glittered briefly before dispersing. These compounds had been designed to neutralize toxins, to break down invasive microbes during planetary plagues, to sterilize environments gone hostile to life. When they interacted with hive biology, the effect was catastrophic. Cellular processes unraveled, metabolic chains snapped, and drones began to fail from the inside out. No explosion marked their deaths. They simply lost cohesion, drifting apart as if life itself had been quietly revoked. The consensus reeled as feedback cascaded through its shared awareness. Drones vanished from its perception not in orderly attrition but in clusters of sudden absence. Control loops stuttered. Predictive models diverged wildly, no longer able to reconcile incoming data with expected outcomes. Tools never intended for combat were dismantling a war organism that had fed unchallenged for centuries. The swarm experienced something dangerously close to uncertainty. More attacks followed, driven by instinct and inertia rather than strategy. Organic lances bored into the layered defenses, only to be swallowed by energy sinks that dispersed their force into harmless glow. Boarding organisms hurled themselves forward and were caught in overlapping tractor webs, pinned, crushed, or redirected into drifting debris fields. Every assault met not an equal and opposite strike, but absorption, redirection, and quiet neutralization. The human construct did not rage. It endured. Within the medical cluster, surgeons and technicians moved through softly lit corridors, their work unchanged by the battle outside. Monitors glowed with vital signs, steady and fragile. Hands adjusted flow rates and sealed microfractures in hull plating with the same care used to close wounds in flesh. Pain existed here, too, in the form of strained muscles and bruised joints, in the ache of holding fear at bay. Yet routines persisted, grounding those inside the storm with familiarity. The swarm attempted to adapt, shifting tactics, altering biological outputs, increasing aggression. Each change arrived moments too late. The human systems responded automatically, their design philosophy rooted in redundancy and resilience. Where one layer strained, another compensated. Where mass was lost, debris was pulled in to replace it. The formation evolved in real time, not through conscious command, but through architectures built to respond to disaster without waiting for permission. From a distance, the engagement looked less like a battle and more like a collision between inevitability and refusal. The swarm's living fleets surged and recoiled against a structure that neither pursued nor retreated. Light from distant stars washed over the scene, indifferent and cold, illuminating fragments of destroyed drones drifting like ash. The famine corridor, long accustomed to silence and decay, now bore witness to something stubbornly alive. Inside the consensus, cascading failure spread. Notes disagreed. Simulations contradicted one another. The swarm had been shaped by environments where resistance took the form of weapons and walls, where victory came from overwhelming force. Here, it faced preparation refined by centuries of catastrophe. Humanity had learned to build systems that assumed collapse was inevitable and planned accordingly. The swarm's strength, honed for domination, found no leverage against that assumption. The human construct continued to hum, its fields glowing softly as they absorbed yet another impact. Stress fractures formed along sacrificial components and were isolated, sealed off, their failure contained. Pain registered in the bodies inside as sharp jolts and lingering soreness, but it did not break focus. People breathed through it, counted heartbeats, and kept working. Hope flickered not as optimism, but as resolve, a quiet insistence that this, too, could be endured. As more drones died to counteragents and gravitational shear, the swarm's advance slowed. Momentum bled away into confusion and loss. What had been a predatory surge became a hesitant probing, then a withdrawal of sorts as formations struggled to reassemble. The consensus strained to reassert control, to impose order on a situation that refused to conform. Humanity's logistics did not answer with fury. There were no triumphant surges, no reckless pursuit. The systems held their ground, continuing to absorb, deflect, and dismantle with relentless calm. This was the quiet violence of preparation, the kind born not from hatred, but from a deep understanding of how fragile things break and how to keep them from doing so. In the cold expanse of the famine corridor, the swarm learned, too late, that it was not facing prey that fought back. It was facing a civilization that had already survived the end of the world many times over and had learned to carry that lesson into the stars. A low, uneven vibration pulsed through the swarm's formations, no longer the clean resonance of unified intent, but a jittering echo that carried hesitation in its rhythm. Debris drifted between living vessels, fragments still warm with fading biological charge, releasing a bitter, mineral scent as they cooled in vacuum. Each destroyed drone left behind more than absence. It left distortion, a gap in the consensus where certainty had once flowed smoothly, like a river suddenly encountering sinkholes. Calculations continued, because calculation was existence, yet their outputs no longer converged. Probabilities spread instead of narrowing, branching into outcomes that contradicted one another. Assault vectors that should have succeeded dissolved into failure. Adaptive responses arrived misaligned with the threat, tuned for weapons and strategies that were not present. The swarm felt the strain as a kind of pressure headache across its distributed awareness, a grinding sensation as models were rewritten and discarded in rapid succession. Something unnamed but essential was eroding. Across the human formation, the hum of machinery remained steady. Shields glowed with soft, persistent light, bearing scars of impact that were already being smoothed by automated repair systems. Tractors idled at readiness, their field coils warm and resonant. Medical forges cycled down from emergency output, venting residual heat that shimmered like ghostly breath against the cold. Inside the hulls, bodies sagged against harnesses, muscles trembling from prolonged tension. Sweat cooled on skin, leaving a faint chill that raised gooseflesh despite regulated temperatures. Fatigue settled in layers. Hands shook as they reached for familiar controls, then steadied through repetition. Eyes burned from staring at readouts that scrolled endlessly, each line another confirmation that systems were holding, barely but enough. Pain registered in bruises and strained joints, in the dull throb behind temples where adrenaline had burned too long. Yet no one disengaged. There was work to finish, and beyond the hulls, there were worlds waiting. The swarm pressed again, more cautiously now. Smaller clusters advanced, testing rather than charging. Each probe met the same response: absorption, redirection, neutralization. Defensive fields flexed and recovered. Counteragents bloomed briefly and faded, leaving empty space where attackers had been. Every exchange fed new data into the consensus, and every data set made prediction less reliable. The hive had been shaped by environments where resistance either collapsed or escalated into comprehensible patterns. Here, resistance behaved like weather, like tectonics, like disaster mitigation protocols unfolding without malice. Within the consensus, a novel feedback loop emerged. Loss no longer translated cleanly into urgency. Instead, it generated caution. Drones hesitated at the edge of engagement, their guidance signals carrying conflicting priorities. Advance and withdraw overlapped in equal measure. For the first time, the swarm began to conserve itself not because resources were low, but because outcomes were opaque. Confidence, once so complete it had never required acknowledgement, was thinning into something brittle. Humanity's strength revealed itself not through pursuit, but through immobility. The convoy did not chase retreating drones. It did not surge forward to capitalize on advantage. It remained where it was, an interlocked mass of vessels whose purpose extended beyond survival. Cargo holds stayed sealed, their contents intact, food grown under artificial suns, medicines synthesized molecule by molecule, atmospheric processors tuned to coax breath from poisoned skies. The refusal was palpable even across the void. Refusal to abandon those supplies. Refusal to redefine the mission. Inside one cargo carrier, automated systems redistributed mass to compensate for external stresses, shifting pallets by fractions of a unit. The motion produced a soft, familiar clatter, the sound of freight settling, a noise known to every relief worker who had slept beside their cargo on long transits. The sound carried comfort. It meant the ship was still doing what it had been built to do. Nearby, a crew member adjusted a torn glove and flexed aching fingers, feeling circulation return, then returned attention to the steady flow of diagnostics. The swarm observed this constancy and found no metric for it. There was no escalation curve to analyze, no surge of aggression to counter. The humans treated the ongoing engagement as another variable in a long chain of crises. Energy budgets were adjusted. Redundancies were activated, where was monitored and mitigated. War, to them, was not a singular event demanding total transformation. It was another form of disaster layered atop famine, plague, and environmental collapse, all of which had shaped their logistics from the beginning. As losses mounted without corresponding progress, the consensus began to withdraw resources from the engagement. Not all at once, not in panic, but in a gradual reallocation driven by statistical paralysis. Models could not agree on the cost of continued assault. Predictions of victory ranged from improbable to undefined. The presence of humans introduced noise that could not be filtered out. The swarm did not understand refusal as a strategic posture. only as inefficiency. Now inefficiency was eroding its advantage. The retreat manifested as thinning shadows. Living vessels pulled back, their movements cautious, overlapping fields retracting. The pressure on human defenses eased incrementally, like a storm losing momentum. Inside the convoy, alerts softened from critical to severe, then to elevated. Shoulders slumped as the immediate threat receded, though vigilance remained. The smell of overheated components lingered, mingled with antiseptic and recycled air, grounding everyone in the reality of what had nearly been lost. The consensus attempted one final recalculation, drawing on historical data from countless assimilations. It searched for parallels, for any precedent where prey had refused to behave as prey. None fit. Humanity did not fight to dominate or to exterminate. It fought to remain present. That distinction fractured the logic at the core of the hive. Without predictable escalation, there could be no stable forecast. Without forecast, there could be no certainty. And without certainty, the swarm could not commit. Thus the withdrawal completed, not as defeat, but as unresolved equation. The hive left behind wreckage and unanswered questions, carrying with it a new variable that would haunt future expansions. In the quiet that followed, the famine corridor seemed to exhale. Stars burned on, indifferent and distant, their light falling on a convoy that had not moved an inch from its course. Within the human formation, systems continued their work. Repairs progressed. Medical checks cycled through crews, flagging exhaustion and stress for later care. Cargo remained secured. Beyond the hulls, starving worlds still waited, their orbits unchanged by the battle that had spared them. Humanity endured in the small ways it always had, by finishing the task, by tending the wounded, by refusing to let fear redefine purpose. The swarm retreated because it could no longer see the end of the equation. Humanity remained because it had never needed to. Engines breathed back to life with a restrained, familiar cadence, their vibration rolling through hulls like a steadying pulse after fever. The convoy loosened its interlocked posture in careful stages, releasing stress held for too long in metal and muscle alike. Defensive fields dimmed from radiant skins to invisible shells, leaving behind faint afterimages that shimmered and vanished. The smell of scorched insulation faded, replaced by the cleaner notes of recycled air and disinfectant. Space reclaimed its silence, vast and cold, as if nothing extraordinary had happened within its depths. The course never changed. Navigational beacons realigned, thrusters adjusted by measured degrees, and the convoy resumed its original trajectory through the famine corridor. Damaged components were isolated and repaired on the move. Redundant systems, built for exactly this kind of attrition, took over without complaint. Inside the ships, bodies began to feel the weight of what had passed. Exhaustion settled deep, pulling shoulders down and slowing steps. Bruises darkened. Hands ached. Yet routines continued, anchored by the simple truth that arrival still mattered. The first world awaited beneath a thin, unstable sky, its atmosphere ragged from years of neglect and stellar fluctuation. As the convoy descended, atmospheric stabilizers unfolded like vast mechanical pedals, releasing controlled streams of engineered particulates. The planet's upper layers shuddered, then steadied, pressure gradients smoothing into something breathable. The glow of re-entry lit human hulls in bands of orange and white, heat roaring across shielding that had already proven its worth. The ground rose to meet them, scarred and waiting. Hospitals followed, blooming outward from cargo bays with practiced efficiency. Modular corridors locked into place, their surfaces warm and clean under artificial light. Power grids hummed as life support reached full capacity. The scent of antiseptic grew strong, sharp, and reassuring. Medical personnel moved with quiet urgency, their fatigue set aside in favor of focus. Stretched limbs found new purpose as they lifted, carried, stabilized. Instruments chirped softly, translating fragile pulses into visible assurance. Supplies flowed next. Food packs were distributed in steady lines, their contents calibrated for malnutrition and long hunger. Water processors began their patient work, drawing purity from contaminated sources. Atmospheric processors anchored themselves into poisoned soil, coaxing oxygen where none had lingered. Each system functioned as intended, indifferent to the fact that it had recently blunted an alien assault. To the machines, catastrophe was just another parameter. Children lived who should have died. That truth unfolded quietly, without ceremony. Small bodies, once listless, warmed beneath blankets and careful hands. Breathing eased. Eyes opened. Crying returned, thin at first, then stronger, filling corridors with sound that cut through exhaustion like light through fog. Adults nearby sagged in relief, some sinking to the floor, others bracing against walls as tension finally released. Tears came without shame, streaking faces still marked by grime and stress. Across the sector, observers struggled to reinterpret what their instruments and senses reported. Long-range arrays replayed data streams that refused to align with established models. Civilian transponders had not scattered. Non-combat vessels had not fled. Human ships had absorbed, redirected, and endured an attack that should have erased them. Analysts accustomed to hierarchies of force found no category that fit what they had witnessed. There were no decisive strikes, no pursuit, no annihilation. There was only persistence. The realization spread slowly, carrying unease with it. Humanity had not defended itself as a warrior race would. It had defended a mission. The distinction unsettled those who measured power in armaments and territory. Humanitarian fleets, long dismissed as vulnerable symbols of misplaced mercy, took on a new gravity. Their oversized cargo holds and redundant systems were re-examined not as inefficiencies, but as deliberate over-engineering shaped by centuries of disaster. Records surfaced from earlier eras, recontextualized in light of recent events. Accounts of aid convoys pushing through war zones on fractured worlds. Of engineers designing relief infrastructure to function under bombardment because famine and conflict so often arrive together. Of medical systems built to operate during evacuation, quarantine, and collapse. What others had seen as excess was revealed as doctrine. Humanity planned for the worst imaginable futures and refused to relinquish compassion even when those futures arrived armed and hungry. Within the convoy, there was no celebration. Repairs continued. Medical checks flagged dehydration, stress fractures, minor radiation exposure, all logged and addressed. Crew members slept in short intervals, boots still on, lulled by the steady thrum of power systems doing their work. In moments of rest, thoughts drifted to home, to small comforts remembered in detail sharp enough to ache. A cup of bitter coffee, the weight of a child asleep against a shoulder, the sound of rain on a roof. These memories grounded them, reminders of why they endured. The swarm did not return. Long-range sensors detected its absence like a hollow where pressure had been. Analysts speculated, recalculated, argued in silence. A hive built on perfect logic had encountered preparation it could not anticipate, a refusal that broke prediction. Against such systems, certainty dissolved. The galaxy absorbed that lesson unevenly, some with awe, others with dread. As the convoy moved on to the next world, stars slid past in slow procession, their ancient light falling on hulls scarred but intact. The contrast remained stark. Vastness pressed in from all sides, an ocean without mercy or intent. Within it traveled fragile lives, protected not by dominance, but by care scaled to survive catastrophe. Humanity's presence among the stars remained small, but it was stubborn, and it carried with it the weight of countless plans for endings that had not yet arrived. In the quiet after engines throttled down for orbital insertion, a crew member paused to steady a shaking hand, feeling the warmth of the deck beneath worn boots. Fear lingered, a shadow at the edge of thought, but it no longer ruled. Purpose filled the space it left behind. Supplies awaited distribution. Atmospheres needed tending. Lives depended on arrival. The convoy continued onward, unchanged in course and intent, a moving testament to a species that had learned to survive by refusing to let the universe dictate the limits of its compassion.